In May of 1921, after a sudden illness, a man named Paul Amadeus Denot slipped into a mysterious coma that lasted an entire year. But as bizarre as this sounds, it wasn't the strangest thing that happened to Denot. When the young Swiss teacher finally came to, not only was he perfectly fine, but he also seemed to have acquired a supernatural ability to predict the future. I know this sounds lefty, sounds freaky, but frankly, due revelation after coming back from his coma are things that simply cannot be accounted for any other way. He spoke of things like a hardware box that brings pictures to life, in other words, an iPad. He also predicted quite a number of things that happened a full century later, like our attempts to colonize Mars and even nuclear wars, and this was all at a time when World War II hadn't even happened. Yet, if you don't believe in paranormal, then the story I'm about to tell you just might shatter your worldview. So embrace yourself, and if you don't believe, you are going to want to. Paul Amadeus Denot was a Swiss-Australian teacher born in Zurich with a deep passion for history and classical philosophy, that is the study of the history of language for the most part. Denot's health was quite fragile, but even that couldn't explain the strange sleep he fell into one day, that fateful day. Dean was going about his regular activities when he suddenly fell into a strange sleep, just like that. Started his friends and family try waking him up from this strange and sudden sleep, but nothing they do roses Dean. This freaks everyone out, so they quickly rush him to the hospital, where the doctors informed them that Dean had slipped into a coma. Even though upon physical examination he couldn't exactly find anything wrong with him, for 14 days Dean remains in this comic sleep until he finally wakes up, much to the relief of his panic-stricken mother naturally do feel. Feeling a bit disoriented, but other than that, he seemed completely fine, and after a couple of weeks, he goes back to his normal life. Perhaps this was just one of those random weird things that happened to people there every once in a while, right? Well, not for the protagonist here, Dean. It wasn't, because 4 years later, in May of 1921, the protagonist would once again fall into the strange sleep. Only this time it was after a brief illness, just like the last time. Nothing they try works, so once again, what do? They drag the protagonist to the hospital, perhaps expecting that he would come to in a few days or weeks, just like he did the last time. Months after months goes by, and a protagonist Dean is still unconscious. His mother even passes out while waiting for him to come out of this strange coma, but just never wakes up. Then one day in May of 1922, a full year after he slipped into his second coma, our protagonist blinks and comes back awake. Doc, his recovery is once again a phenomenon. Sure, his muscles are weak from a whole year of non-use, but besides that, he seems perfectly okay. There is just one thing though. Dean seems off. He's not talking to his friends or his family or anyone. He's being shy and quiet, and it just feels like he's hiding something. Could this be brief? He and his mother had a very close relationship, so waking up from his coma to hear that his mom had kicked the bucket waiting for him must have broken his still. There seems to be more than a grief, though is gradually becoming reclusive, burying himself in manual labor during the day and spending his evenings with his nun, buried in books about philosophy. The only person he speaks to now is his priest, which makes the situation even weirder, because before the coma, Dick wasn't exactly what you would call a very religious person. In fact, he was gradually starting to become skeptical about religions, but then after his coma, our protagonist then becomes very invested in religion and spiritual matters, talking to his priest all the time, and even suggesting to him that there was a whole lot about religions and the afterlife that the priest didn't know about what those things were. Though our protagonist Dean wouldn't say anything, a couple of months passed by after Dean's strange coma episode, and he comes down with a bad case of tuberculosis. For months, the disease would persist and worsen until Dino's doctors advised him to move to a more temperature city. This was in October of 1922. With no mother and no friends, Dean probably feels like he no longer has any ties to Zurich anyway. So he picks up his belongings and moves to Athens in Greece, where he gets a job teaching French and Germany. Initially, the change of scenario seems great for our protagonist Dino, but it seems to doesn't take long before the people of the city starts to notice that something is off about this man. For instance, one of these days, our protagonist Dingo is sitting in front of the Parthenon, the ruins of an ancient temple built in honor of the Greek goddess Athena. There, a young man comes to sit beside him and makes a passing comment about how someone 2,000 years ago probably sat at the same spot where they were sitting looking at the rock, and that if they focused only on the rock and nothing else, it could almost be like they had traveled back in time to that era 2,000 years ago. Dan immediately agrees with the young man's theory, but then putting his own spin on it. Our protagonist Dean adds that since the Parthenon would still be the same in 2,000 years, staring at it and forgetting everything else, it could also be like they had traveled forward in time. But then he adds one thing that totally freaks his new friend out after, saying that the Parthenon would remain the same in 2,000 years. He says, except then there will be no bars around it. They will have gotten rid of them. The seriousness and sense of absolute certainty that Dino, a protagonist, has allowed him proves too much for his new friend, so the young man awkwardly walks away from Dino. Very likely, it wasn't just this young man who found Dino, a protagonist, weird in Athens, but there was one man who didn't. One man who admired and respected our protagonist, Dino, a lot. His name was George Papahatis, and he was a student of our protagonist, Dino. Over time, Dino and Papahatis would get closer and closer, and Dean would share his life with his beloved student, except for one thing: his mysterious coma experience. Well, it probably didn't matter because Dean was about to have a bigger issue anyway. In April of 1923, 6 months after moving to Greece, Dino's tuberculosis symptoms started to show again. Significantly at this point, Dean is coughing a lot more than usual, and he can tell that he is not going to be allowed for much longer, so he begins to put his house in order. The only unresolved issue left being his coma experience. As days turn into weeks and weeks into months, do battle with whether or not to share his coma experience. Unfortunately, his mind has failed him and he can't even seem to recall correctly everything that he experienced during the coma. This troubles Dean a lot. Until one day, it all starts coming back to him. All of a sudden, it's like a huge weight has been lifted from his shoulders. Duke is so happy and excited that even his landlady notices. He sits down to put pen to paper and over the course of many days, he puts down his coma experience as accurately as he can remember it. What he put down on those pages is what you are about to find out. Pau Amadeus Dino passed away in 1924, presumably due to tuberculosis, and for 50 years his name was lost to history until 1972 when his beloved student George Papanas published a book. This book, it turns out, is a translation of a protagonist Dino's old diary, and its contents is a chronicle of everything that happened to Dan while was in the second coma. A protagonist Dina had entrusted Papa's Hanses with the diary as practice material, so Papa's Hanses could work on his German by translating the content of the diary into Greek. Dino's only instructions to Papa's was that he could not publish the content of the diary for any reason. Well, I guess Papa's Hattas kind of fabled that one, or forgot it. But his deficiency is the reason we have this video today. So maybe there was a silver lining after all anyway. As Paparazzi begins to translate the diary, he finds some early entries about Dino's heartbreak when his first love marries another man and dies soon after. The later entries, however, are where things start to get really strange. At first, the writings seems a little confusing, almost like Dean was trying to say something without saying something, but then as Dean approaches death, he begins to write much more freely. Here's how he describes his coma experience. Hold on to your seats because it's about to go down.
It's about to go down.
According to Dean, on the first day of his coma, he woke up to a group of people staring down at him in a strange room. Outside of his window was a beautiful countryside with colors of blue and green blended together, and on the wall of his room a soft pink light bounced off the crystal on the wall, giving the room an otherworldly feel. At first, Dean begins to wonder if this is heaven, or maybe one of those planets he would been hearing about with the intelligent alien creatures, but he finally realizes that he is in a hospital, the strangest, most beautiful hospital he's ever been in for 9 days. Dan is unable to leave his bed because he is in so much pain and his mind is fuzzy, but from the 10th day, Dean finds that he is able to move around a bit, and by 12th day, just 3 days after he first starts to move around, he feels almost completely fine, a recovery that just astounds, but not as much as his next experience in this strange, beautiful hospital. Now up to this point, Dean has had a bandage on his head, even though he couldn't recall why it's there. So when he looks into a mirror, he doesn't see much, just the bandage. But then a few days later, the nurse unwraps his head and Dean sees his face in the mirror for the first time. When he does, he crumbles onto the floor, confused as he heads towards the verge of a nervous breakdown. The man staring back at him at terror from the mirror wasn't him. He had never seen this man before in his life. Who was he? Dean gets so panicked and manic that the nurses are ordered not to go near him. Instead, he is left in the care of two specific physicians, the chief doctor and another doctor. As the doctors try to communicate with him, Dean realizes that he can't make out what language they are speaking, which is odd, considering Dean's specifically in languages. He does sense that the language has a bit an Anglo-Scandinavia blend though, but that's all he can make of it, and it really weirds him out. After a few days, Dean finally calms down and is allowed to take walks around the facility, a place unlike anything he had ever seen in his life. For instance, there is this great hall where everything is made of crystal, and one day, Dean is walking across this wall when he sees a group of doctors and nurses huddled together and chatting. He can't really hear them because they are whispering and also because of the language barrier, but he can make out a few words here and there. One name that seems to be going aloud a lot is Andreas Nordholm, which then assumes to be the same of the man whose body he was in. The more Dean, our protagonist, listens to, the more he is able to get a few more bits and pieces of the puzzle, and from what he gathers, Andreas Nordholm had been involved in an accident which killed him, but then the doctors froze his brain for some minutes and were able to revive him. Well, revive in a sense, because as you and I know, Dean and Dean know, even though these people were looking at Andreas Nordholm had not actually come back to life. Obviously, this sounds absolutely insane, and Dean realizes it too. So he decides to play along and not tell anyone the secret about his true identity. Now, up to this point, our protagonist Dean thinks he is in 1921, but while speaking to one of the doctors, he learns that he is not actually in 1921, but in 3906. This punches Dean again into another nervous breakdown, because unless he was the subject of the elaborate prank, not only had he switched bodies, he had also somehow jumped forward in time by 2,000 years in just one night. Dean new reality takes a while to sink in. Psychologically, he's in the year 1921, but physically, he finds himself in the year 3906, and it's really conflicting for him. Perhaps it was this mental block, or maybe it was something else, but our protagonist Dean found that he could no longer fall asleep, which is ironic when you consider that he got into this mysterious situation as a result of an illness that caused mysterious sleep. Anyway, shortly after our protagonist Dean found out whose body he was in and what year it was, he is taken to meet a group of people called the Rectors. The Rectors are spiritual leaders with a royal and mysterious aura to them, and when a protagonist Dean sees them, he immediately falls on his face, sobbing and confessing, opening up about his past and the truth of who he really is. The men seems impatient, but they don't do much to help Dean except to say some stuff about reality and human cognition that our protagonist Dean didn't really get after meeting the Rectors and confessing his true identity to them. Dean meets Andreas Nordholm's mentor, Georgia, as well as his best friend Stefan, two men teach Dean a lot of things about the future and introduced to a box that turns words into pictures and sound so he could learn even more, which kind of sounds like our modern day iPad, doesn't it? Anyway, this device called the Regan switch is what Dean used to learn about the past or our future. Dean is allowed to learn as much as he wants about all the centuries leading up to 3906. With one exception, he couldn't learn about the 20th century. Joel felt that Dean, knowing about a past that he could be in a position to change, might be bad for the timeline. By the way, just to clarify, both Georgia and Stefan knew the truth about Dean's identity. Now, he is what Dean, our protagonist, learned about our future. First, humans are going to have a very difficult 3 centuries from 2000s to 2300. During this time, humans will struggle with overpopulation and lots of international conflicts. In the middle of this, we will still continue to record astronomical achievement and quite literally too, because he colonized Mars in 2012 and for 60 long years after that, the human colony on Mars will grow to 22 million. Unfortunately, massive impact events would hit Mars, wiping out the entire human colony on it. And because of that, humans will not attempt to colonize Mars or any other planet for a very long time. By 2309, humans will experience a medium-scale war that will last for 80 years. This war will inherit the human population, especially Europe. Only the Baltic and Scandinavian countries will survive, perhaps explaining why the language is 3906 had an Anglo-Scandinavian blood. Anyway, after the nuclear war, by 2396, the human population would be in aggressive decline until a new world government rises up and ends the global war, making the beginning of a new history for human race. This new world government will eventually prove to be very corrupt, though, as it will mostly be run by oligarchs. So for 200 years, people will resist this government until it eventually falls and the businesses of governance is moved to the vicars, humanitarians, and scientists. Once again, this will mark a new beginning for humanity. Now, following that, for next 300 years, mankind will undergo a massive societal reform, shifting from a scarcity-based economic system to an adequacy-based system. In other words, people will start working for the greatest good rather than working to accumulate wealth. At first, people will work for 40 years and then retire, after which the global community will look after them. But by the time do arrives in 3906, other people only have to work for 2 years in a compulsory program called a service. The service begins at age after a person has completed their education and ends at the age of 19 when they retire, and then pursue whatever life they want. Sure, you could work the man whose body Dean was in, for instance, was a physician, But at this point in history, money isn't exactly in use anymore, as people now see value in arts and science rather than in material possessions. So as long as you complete your service years, you don't need to ever worry about money again. But what about human greed? Do humans just stop being greedy and develop perhaps contentment in 2000 years? Well, in it sounds like we do, according to Dean's diary. Around the year 3000, something called the Nebo Beach happened, and this event comes with a new spiritual ability called the Oversun. Our super senses, it's an ability that makes it possible for mankind to tap into the vast reservoirs of spiritual knowledge, which sounds great until you find out that everyone who experienced that Nile beach when it first happened died. The strong rush of emotion proved too much for them, and so their body succumbed in 3382. Though the first man survives the niche beach, and then from then on, everyone starts surviving it, which leads to the evolution of a new species of man called the Homo occidentalis novus, or the new Western man, because human nature essentially changes thanks to the now beach. There will be no need for laws in the future. Everyone works for the common good, and all the saints leading up to that enlightenment will be viewed as the Dark Ages. Speaking of human nature, Dean observed that people of 1339 or 6 had a peculiarity about them. They seemed like carefree children with no single worry in the world, and this made him wonder how they planned to survive if they received an external threat from, say, aliens. Well, as it turns out, they had already met with aliens plenty of times, and the encounters turned out to be quite pleasant. One day, Stefan decides to take Dean to a super city called Norera, which obviously did not exist in 1921 and still does not exist today. According to Dean's account, Norera was the 4th largest city in the world, and people described the places as a fairy tale land. In that city, Dean saw many mansions as tall as mountains, a lake shore that was lined with synthetic marbles, hanging gardens, floating shops, floating observatories, floating log, and vast underground cities. This probably sounds unimpressive to you, being born in a generation where science fiction movies are, well, Dean doesn't. But keep in mind that Dean lived in an era where science fictions were hardly a thing. Movies hadn't even started taking in Dean's time. Yet Dean is measuring inventions that sound a lot like 3D movies and Jubitrons. Anyway, being highly interested in philosophical matter, Dean obviously loves his new life in 3906, and with the highlighted spiritual enlightenment and the deep thinkers he gets to interact with, then one day he decides it's time for him to take a spiritual journey to a place where, as the Valley of Roses, the spiritual center of the city home to the spiritual elite who had dedicated their lives to the study of philosophy and science, guided by his friend Stefan. Dean visits the Valley of Roses only to fly on a flying boat, and the place is everything you would imagine it to be, completely overworldly, with shimmering lights, beautiful flowers, bushes, magnificent temples and monuments, and precious stones everywhere. Dean instantly falls in love with this place and spends the next few weeks there. Sadly, the longer Dean stays there, the more yearning for his old life starts to lash over him, getting stronger and stronger with each passing day. Specifically, Dean is hit with a strong wave of nostalgia for his first love, Anne, which leads us to another wild experience that Dean has while on Adriana's Gnome. Body for context: as a young man, Dean met and fell in love with a girl from his village named Anna. Unfortunately, things didn't quite turn out to they both hoped, as Anne's family forced her to marry another man, and she even died soon after that. But now, just before Anne got married, on one of those evenings, Anne and Dean went up a hill to spend one last night together. After sharing a few beautiful hours, Anne decides it's time for them to go back to. But just before they leave, Dean, a protagonist, makes Anne promise him that he would see her again. Anne agrees. In fact, she goes further to promise him that the next time they did, she would make a wreath from the wild flowers on the hill where they sat, and she would give it to him to put on her head. Now here's where it gets crazy. In that 906, as Adrio's Noah, Dino starts a relationship with a girl named Nam Sivia. One day, nearly a year after Dean first wakes up in the future, the two decide to go on a day trip to Dino's old village, though Sylvia doesn't know that this is where they are going. When they get there, they spend many hours touring the place and then end up on a hill where they share a picnic. And that's when the most curious thing happened. After spending a couple of hours on the hill, Sylvia decides that it's time to leave, but then she picks up some wild flowers, makes them into the wreath, and then gives them to Dean to place on her head. The simple act throws Dean for a second. This is exactly what Anne promised she would do the next time they saw each other. Could Anne have switched bodies and time travel to 3906 too? Did she really not die? Dean is still pondering this when he gets back from their day trip, so he shares his wild experience with Sylvia and Stefan. In response, Stefan explains that time isn't linear and that Sylvia was very likely Anne's reincarnation, so that traveled through time to fulfill her promise. Before you scoff, here's something I didn't mention at first. When Dean first met Sylvia, Stefan had explained to him that Adrian's Nodom had been in love with Sylvia since forever, but that Sylvia didn't love him in return. So how come Sylvia, who felt nothing for Nodom before, suddenly started feeling something for him? When Dino's consciousness started leaving his body, this has to be evidence for reincarnation, right? Anyway, as Dean picked on that realization, he slowly starts to feel drowsy for the first time since he woke up in 3906, and how he managed to stay awake for a whole year beats me, but slowly and gently his eyelids fluttering, and then they cross, and then he falls asleep. By the time Dinok wakes up, he's back in the 20th century and back to his old body. Now, I know what you are thinking. This story is too incredible to believe, but